Hello everybody, this is Dr. Zhao. In this video, you will learn the bargaining power analysis. The objective of bargaining power analysis is to find out what is my leverage, what is my supplier's leverage, and who has the bargaining power. This knowledge is important in negotiation because you will know if you or your supplier should concede in making the deal. You will learn how to quantify the leverages, either buying or selling, and the bargaining power index, which measures the relative bargaining power. The ratio of payable days over receivable days is also an important indicator of the bargaining power. We shall leave it to supplier analysis. First, we consider a special case, a monopolized market. As a buyer in this market, you have no power to negotiate. You can either take it or leave it. An example of a monopolized market is the U.S. railroads. There are 4 major railway companies in the U.S. Each covers a specific region, and thus there's no alternative suppliers for rail freight services. Right, so you can either take it or leave it. The second special case is the duopolized market with 2 dominant players. An example of the duopoly market is the U.S. air freight, with 2 major players, UPS and FedEx, splitting nearly 70% of the market. How to take down 2 giants at one time when you cannot handle even one of them? The only way is to create competition between the 2 for your business. Of course, the more value your business has, the better the result would be. In a general competitive market with multiple suppliers, you can use the bargaining power analysis to assess the leverages of the buyer and supplier. Intuitively, if I buy 50% of your volume, which is only 5% of my spend in this category, then I have a bargaining power over you. For example, Walmart may buy a significant portion of a small company's yearly output, which may only be a small fraction of what Walmart sold or bought in this category. The buyer has the bargaining power because if there's no deal, the supplier loses 50% of its sales while the buyer only loses 5% of the supply. Conversely, if I buy 5% of your volume, which is 50% of my spend in this category, then you have a bargaining power over me. For example, Intel is the largest semiconductor manufacturer, selling its microchips to many customers. Being a relatively smaller customer, Huawei heavily depends on Intel's chip supply for its notebooks and cell phones. In this case, the supplier has the bargaining power because if there's no deal, supplier loses 5% of the sales, but the buyer loses 50% of the supply. Following the intuition and example, we can calculate the leverages as follows. Consider a buyer, a supplier, and a category. The buyer's leverage can be measured by the buyer's spend on the supplier as a percentage of the supplier's sales, or equivalently, the buyer's contribution to the supplier's revenue. The supplier's leverage is the buyer's spend on the supplier as a percentage of the buyer's total spend in a category, or equivalently, the supplier's contribution to the buyer's category. The bargaining power index, BPI, is defined to be the ratio between the buyer's leverage and the supplier's leverage. So if BPI is much smaller than 1, then the supplier has the bargaining power because the buyer needs the supplier more than the other way around. If BPI is much greater than 1, then the buyer has the bargaining power because the supplier needs the buyer more than the other way around. If the BPI is about 1, then the bargaining power is balanced. They need each other equally. In what follows, I shall use some examples to explain the BPI. To exemplify BPI, let's consider Huawei and its purchase of semiconductors. Huawei is one of the biggest communication equipment manufacturers in China. Its top global suppliers include 33 US companies, such as Qualcomm, Intel, Micron, Broadcom, and Texas Instruments. We shall use Huawei's data to calculate Huawei's leverages and US suppliers' leverages. 2015 data shows that Huawei's total spend on microchips or semiconductors is $14 billion, among which $1.8 billion on Qualcomm, $680 million on Intel, $580 million on Micron, $600 million on Broadcom, and $400 million on Texas Instruments. The 2015 revenue of these suppliers are also listed here. The suppliers' leverage can be calculated by dividing the spend on the supplier with the total spend. So, for instance, Intel's leverage over Huawei is $680 million over $14 billion, which is 4.686%. Huawei's leverage can be calculated by dividing the spend on the supplier with the supplier's revenue. So, for example, Huawei's leverage over Intel is $680 million over $55 billion, which is 1.23%. And finally, the BPI for Intel and Huawei is 0.25, which implies that Intel has a bargaining power over Huawei. We can see that Qualcomm also has a bargaining power over Huawei, but Huawei has a bargaining power over Broadcom. Huawei's leverage over Texas Instruments and Micron is about the same as these suppliers' leverages over Huawei, so their bargaining powers are about the same. We can do the same analysis for Apple with its major semiconductor suppliers. Apple's total semiconductor spend in year 2016 is about $15.7 billion. And you can see that after the calculation, Apple has a bargaining power over many suppliers such as Skyworks. But Qualcomm and TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, had a bargaining power over Apple. Before we conclude this video, let us discuss how to improve the bargaining power. For the buyer to increase her leverage, she can increase her spend on the supplier by increasing her sales volume or consolidating the purchases. For the supplier to increase her leverage, she can increase her supply market dominance. For example, her supply as a percentage of the total market supply by exclusivity, such as technology, innovation, and patent. In summary, we discussed in this video how to quantify the buyer's leverage, the supplier's leverage, and use the bargaining power index to determine who has the bargaining power in negotiation.